James Dye was a prominent justice of the peace in Wayne Township in the early 19th century. He had a large farm between Brave and Jollytown on Tom's Run Road, and when he died in 1842, he was buried in a small family cemetery on his property. In the 1940s, probably, the family that owned his farm removed the headstones from the graves and piled them up against a large tree because they wanted to plant a garden. Later, mines took over the property and developed it, and by all accounts, we believe that the actual cemetery proper was destroyed. We think it was ruined when the mines graded on the land there. And unfortunately, the mines probably had no idea that they did that when they did that, so I don't want to put, blame where there isn't any. In the 1960s, however, a descendant of James Dye recovered his headstone from around the tree where all the stones were placed and moved it a few miles away to the Meehan Cemetery where other members of his family were buried in an effort to preserve his stone. However, the stones for his wife and son and a few other fieldstone markers were left laying around the tree. For many, many years, the location of the cemetery was somewhat unknown. Then we discovered it in the mid to late 90s and photographed the stones, what was left of them, and sort of left it at that. Well, in 2013, we discovered that the tree that the stones were laying on had died and was cut down and removed. So we decided it was time to preserve the rest of the stones so that they didn't become lost to history. So after consulting with Consol, who owned the property, and the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, we came up with a plan to recover the stones, and since by all accounts we believe that the cemetery itself had been destroyed and we were unable to place the stones back on their graves, we decided to collect the stones, repair them as best as we could, and move them to the Meehan Cemetery where James Dye's stone had already been placed in the 1960s, so that even though the graves themselves were lost, there was still a memorial to the Dye family that was buried in this cemetery. Not the best case scenario, but at least something was preserved. We recovered 3 headstones in total, 2 stones actually for Mary Dye. The original stone that was placed in 1821 when she died, and a second headstone for her that was placed there in 1842 that matched the stone that was put for her husband James. And we also recovered fragments of a headstone for Reason Dye, a son of James and Mary. And then again, a few fieldstone markers and a couple footstones. We were unable to recover all of the parts for Reason Dye's headstone. There was a large center section that you'll see in the slideshow of photographs that we couldn't recover. So unfortunately, we did not reassemble his headstone, although it has been kept. It's preserved as it was, but for the purposes of restoring the cemetery, what we did is we got a small plaque that we put on Mary Dye's later headstone, the 1842 headstone, that had the same inscription that was on Reason's headstone, since we were unable to reassemble it and put it back together. And that sort of is how we completed our preservation efforts in 2013. So in the last segment, we learned a little bit about James and Mary Dye and where their original grave sites were and how their headstones ended up here at the Meehan Cemetery in Gilmore Township, just outside of Jollytown. As you can see, Mary Dye's headstone, we had fixed this about 15 years ago and the adhesive gave out. So what we're going to do today is we're going to recover this headstone and take it back to my house where we're going to use an epoxy to glue it back together, and then we will bring it back here and attach it to the base. And Ryan, if you'll give me a hand, we'll move this to my car and begin the process. All right, now to get the rest. All right, welcome back. As you saw in the last segment, we've recovered Mary Dye's headstone from the Meehan Cemetery, and now we're on my front porch in Brave, and we are going to reassemble this, let it set, and eventually we will mount it back to its base in place in the cemetery. So what we have chosen to repair this headstone, I consulted several people, and what I ultimately decided to go with was a Sika masonry adhesive. And the reason I chose that is basically, if for some reason this headstone would fail again, it will break at the points where it's already broken and not cause any new damage. So this may fail in the future, but it will not create more damage. And this is also reversible, so if a better preservation method comes along, we will be able to utilize that in the future to make a better repair. When you're dealing with repairing headstones like these, you can talk to many people and everyone has their own method that they choose, and some will say some are better than others. Again, the reasons why we've gone with this specifically are for its preservation and future rehabilitation of it. This is to stabilize it, hopefully for another 20, 30, 40 years. So what we're going to do now is we're going to apply beads of this adhesive on the stone, and then we will set it back together. Now we do have a bit of an unusual circumstance here. I'm going to apply a little bit of adhesive to the face of the marker here, and that will be to support this memorial marker for resin dye that we used to kind of stabilize this when we initially repaired this about 15 years ago. So with that done, I'm going to bring these first two pieces back together, making sure that everything lines up appropriately. And then I will glue this piece on next. And you can see here, I'm not overdoing the adhesive, just sort of a zigzag line, and trying to keep it so that it won't squeeze out once the stone is back together. In fact, I'm going to add a little bit of extra adhesive here to get this joint. And again, I'm paying very close attention to making sure I get everything lined up properly. And then a little more on the top. and everything is back in place. So we're going to let this set up for a few days, and when you see us in the next segment, we will be reinstalling this on its base. Thank you. Unfortunately, due to some technical errors, we lost the video of us reinstalling the upper portion of Mary Dye's headstone to its base. Thankfully, we did have a few pictures in the process, so sadly to say, they will have to substitute for actual video in this segment of this little movie. So I do apologize for that, but continue watching. Thanks.